Hey everyone, Charlie here, and today we're going to talk about partial preterism, which you can't really do without also covering futurism and full preterism, and partial preterism lives right in the middle of those two perspectives. We are not talking about millennialism, and there are many views. There's historic, premillennial, post, and amillennial. And although some of the topics do overlap with millennialism views, Preterism has mostly to do with the prophecies in Revelation, as well as the prophecies made by Jesus in Matthew 24:25, as well as Luke 21 and Mark 13. Now, the first thing I'm going to draw your attention to, and then we'll bounce around as we're explaining these different views, is Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1, very first verse, Jesus says, God gave his servants a vision of what must soon take place. Full preterists and partial preterists really pay attention to statements like this because they seem to be important. They seem to be indicating something that matters, a time frame for the things that are about to be discussed. Not only is it mentioned here, but it's also mentioned once again in verse 3. The time is near, right? Blessed are those who hear it and take to heart because the time is near. In the first three chapters of Revelation, twice this statement is made. Let's go to Revelation 22, down to verse 10. Same thing is said, and we'll do a little comparison here with Daniel in a second. Do not seal up the words of this prophecy because the time is near, right? So what is the angel or what is God trying to say through John about this revelation? Hey, these things we're about to talk about are things that seem like they are about to happen, or the time is near. What does he mean by the word near? I can't exactly tell you. And again, some people think that the book of Revelation was written after the fall of Jerusalem. Many believe it was written before the fall of Jerusalem. And so if it was written before the fall of Jerusalem, then it could have definitely been outlining the events that happened during that time period. The 7-year war, the middle of that war was 70 AD. I talk about some of that stuff in other videos in more detail, but partial preterists really pay attention to this, and so do full preterists. So what does a full preterist think of something like this? They say, hey, listen, from Revelation 1 to Revelation 22, it says the time is near. Therefore, everything in Revelation has been fulfilled. This is the perspective of a full preterist. A futurist looks at Revelation 4 when the prophecies really start through 22, and a futurist says, we don't think any of this stuff has really been fulfilled yet, right? There's still going to be all these woes and trumpets and witnesses, and a lot of stuff happens in Revelation we're not going to dive into because we're really just trying to break down what are these perspectives. So what does a partial preterist think? Well, a partial preterist thinks that some of this stuff has been fulfilled and some is still in the future. So partial preterist lives between futurism and full preterism, which are sort of the two extremes. And I'm not saying extremes in a negative sense. That the prophecies of Jesus and the prophecies of Revelation either live completely in the future or completely in the past. So I said we'd look at Daniel. Why are we going to look at Daniel? Well, Daniel's a great, for instance, because you see this phrase, do not seal up the words of this prophecy. It's sort of a mnemonic phrase. It's used in biblical prophecy. And we'll see the exact same phrase if we go to Daniel. So let's go way back to Daniel. And let's go to chapter 8. Now, this is Daniel's visions, and the visions are actually explained to Daniel in this book, which is great. We don't have to guess what they mean. There are parts that are still kind of up for interpretation, but most of Daniel's visions are about what's going to take place for the next 500-600 years leading up to the return of Christ. And it says in Daniel 8, which is kind of right in the middle of a lot of those prophecies, it says down in verse 26, this right here. The vision of the evenings and the mornings been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, right? There's that same kind of phrase. Seal up the vision. That doesn't mean like don't tell anybody. It just means like, hey, you're going to have to hold on to this for a long time, for it concerns the distant future, right? So what's being talked about here? Well, Daniel is living in the Babylonian era although part of his time does actually overlap with the Persians, which is fascinating. And so, the Assyrians first attacked Israel, and then it was the Babylonians kind of completed the full attack, and both of the divided kingdoms of Israel were taken. Daniel's living mostly during the Babylonian era. Then the Persians came along. Then the Romans came along. So, but this happened over hundreds of years, right? So, what it's saying is, hey, I'm going to give you a lot of insight on what God is doing through the different foreign nations, sort of preparing for His kingdom to come. But it concerns the distant future. So, what does that mean? That means within 500 or 600 years, all this stuff will be fulfilled. So again, if you compare that to Revelation, for instance, where it says, "Don't seal up the vision," this stuff is going to happen soon. It would make a lot of sense if, let's say, the Revelation of John was written somewhere between 60 to 66 A.D. after Christ, and then those events took place within the next couple years, right? Which is, there's different views on when Revelation was written. There's different views on when Daniel was written too. A lot of people think because the events were so specifically described, Daniel actually had to be written in the 2nd century AD. There's no way Daniel could predict all this stuff would happen in the 6th century BC when this is supposed to have all taken place. We think actually prophecy does work like that. If you're more traditional like me, I think God could have totally told Daniel all this stuff was going to happen beforehand. So again, this is where we're trying to take these time frame statements into consideration whenever we look at the prophecies of Jesus or John. Now, I'm not going to go into crazy detail here, but I am going to show you quickly because I actually cover on another video, should we predict the second coming of Christ? I cover these passages in way more detail, right? But we're going to look at Matthew 23 really quickly because there are more time frame statements we need to take into account when it comes to these prophecies of Jesus. So you look at Matthew 23, I'm skipping a lot of stuff. Basically, this is Jesus going after the religious leaders of his day. He thought they were pretty terrible. And Jesus says at the end of Matthew 23, or almost the very end, he says, "Truly, all of this will come on this generation," right? You religious leaders are the worst. All these judgments and woes are going to happen to you. And then if you go into Matthew 24, Jesus says pretty much the exact same thing, which is right up here. "Even when you see all these things, you'll know that the time is near. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." So again, if you're following my logic, by the way, the same phrase is used in Mark 13 and Luke 21. I don't think I'm going to go over there because, like I said, I've got another video about should we predict the return of Christ that covers that in way more detail. But Jesus is saying something very definitive here, that the things I'm prophesying are going to happen within this generation, right? You know that it is near. There's that word again, near. You know that summer is near, right? So, what are all these things that Jesus has just been talking about? Well, in the previous chapter, it was all the judgments and woes against religious leaders. In this chapter, up to this point, he has been talking about the coming of the Son of Man in a big judgment, right? The temple being destroyed and all these different signs and things that people get really excited about when they see modern day events happening. Like we see things happening in the heavens, right? Heavenly bodies being shaken, or we hear about wars of rumors of wars, false messiahs, um, the sign of the prophet Daniel. So there's all this stuff. I'm now going back from that verse at the near the bottom of Matthew 24, famines and earthquakes and things. If you follow a lot of futurists, they are often looking at parts of Revelation and these parts in Mathhew, and they're saying, look, here's this thing. Look at all these things that Jesus described would happen before the coming of the Son of Man. But again, the Son of Man coming this time is really just about this big judgment event that's supposed to happen. And by the way, if you're wondering what was the preface for Matthew 24, it's the disciples asking this question of when will this happen? What is this? Jesus saying that the temple will be destroyed and every stone of the temple will be torn down, which that exactly did happen, by the way, in 70 AD. So again, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this because I did it in another video of all of this, stuff that we look for. But a futurist looks at this and says, hey, maybe a lot of this stuff did happen or versions of it happened during the 7-Year War in 70 AD in Jerusalem and Judea. But we think that there's maybe like a double fulfillment of this, right? And again, I'm I'm not saying that these guys are dumb or they haven't seen these passages here that say this is all going to happen near this generation. I'm saying that they kind of look at it and they say, okay, well, this did kind of happen, but we still think there's a future version of events where it's going to happen again. And similarly in the book of Revelation, because there's a lot of things in Revelation that we can't necessarily draw, same as in this passage, Luke 21, Mark 13, we can't necessarily draw a straight line between, well, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. What does that mean? Is that supposed to be a metaphor or is that like really literal and specific? Because how would that have happened within that generation, right? And I think there's a lot of that where futurists have a very hard time drawing a straight line between the lightning coming from the east. They don't see that in the first century, even though the fall of Jerusalem is incredibly well documented and many crazy things did happen. You could read Flavius Josephus, The War of the Jews. He talks about that a lot. But pretty much, they see all this stuff is still in the future. We partial preterists and full preterists, we like to say we don't think that's the case, right? Even we partial preterists look at the book of Revelation and say, okay, I mean, I think a lot of this stuff happened near, just like it says, but partial preterists think that, hey, we actually still think that some of this stuff is going to happen in the future. Now, let me make this one comment, and again, I don't want to dive deep on this because I did it in the other video. Jesus makes this very important, I think, interpretive statement here. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. That's right after this statement about this generation. These things are all going to happen, right? What's been talked about before is going to happen in this generation. But then Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And then he goes into a totally different description of the coming of the Son of Man, right? Using the same language as above. But in this passage above, look, because you're going to see these signs, and that means Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. I mean, including Jerusalem being totally surrounded and then unsurrounded so that the Christians could escape and leave the city at the time, which is crazy. That actually happened. And then Jesus begins to describe this other coming of the Son of Man, or at least that's what we partial preterists believe. But there will be no signs, right? And the day and the hour unknown, even Jesus says he doesn't know when it's going to happen. And basically, he describes it as a thief in the night. He describes it in the next chapter, Mathhew 25, with 3 different parables, right? The parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the bags of gold, and the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is sort of like the golden rule on steroids. But each one of these parables, now this section, Mathhew 25, the point of this section is because you don't know the day or the hour, right? So we partial preterists, we believe that most of Mathhew 24 has been fulfilled, but we believe that Jesus is, so maybe he came in judgment on Jerusalem for lots of reasons, but then there is a future coming of Jesus, and there's all these parables that are specific to that, and the parables all kind of say the same thing, which is be ready, be a good steward. Also, you just don't know when he's going to show up. So there's not all these signs that point to when this coming of Jesus is going to happen. And again, you'll see a very similar phrase being used in Mathhew, Luke, and Mark, which is heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And then he goes into this other section here. Now, why is that important to me? Well, because I think Jesus is tying together Old Testament prophecies and what's going to be said later in Revelation with this statement, right? So let me show you what I mean by that. So Isaiah, we know that most of Isaiah, or we believe, has been fulfilled, right? Go into Isaiah, the 50s, especially 53. A lot of us know Isaiah 53, suffering servant, Jesus standing up and reading out of Isaiah chapter 61, I believe. Yeah, where he says these things are being fulfilled now in your presence. But if you go to Isaiah 65 and you go halfway down the chapter, all these things are prophesied, they're described. Isaiah 50s through the most of the 60s, we know or we believe are fulfilled. And then you go halfway down Isaiah 65, and you see this phrase being used. See, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, right? Rejoice. There'll be rejoicing in Jerusalem. And he says, the sound of weeping and crying will be heard no more. People will have these crazy long lives, apparently. No longer will they build houses and others will live in them. And there's all these descriptions of this paradise-like experience, which is the wolf and the lamb will feed together, and no one will harm or destroy in all of my holy mountain, says the Lord, right? So while we definitely know a lot of Isaiah has been fulfilled exactly how it was supposed to be fulfilled, there seems to be this kind of key moment where Isaiah begins prophesying about things that a partial preterist thinks that's not really happened. I can definitely draw a lot of lines between a lot of what happened in Isaiah and the ministry of Jesus, and there's a lot of stuff about the different nations and stuff too that already happened. But I can't necessarily see that these parts of Isaiah are fulfilled. You could also go to Ezekiel. Ezekiel has this very interesting description. Again, most of Ezekiel very clearly seems to be fulfilled already. A lot of things about Jesus and the new covenant. So if you go to Ezekiel 40, what you'll see is that Ezekiel sees this city that looks like, basically a huge building and a bunch of buildings, right? And he begins to outline this huge temple and temple court and all this different stuff that he sees, which is very different from the temple that had been originally built. And it's not the same temple that was even in Jesus's day. And so even though he doesn't use the phrase new heavens and new earth, it does seem to be that in Ezekiel, there's this very obvious kind of break between, Ezekiel 39 and Ezekiel 40, where all these things that are prophesied are going to happen. And then there seems to be this very sort of futuristic view, right? Now, we partial preterists will then go to the book of Revelation. And I could go to the book of Revelation and I could start in chapter 4 and I could go down and I could get to chapter 11, the two witnesses. Do I know what they are? Not necessarily. And there's a lot of stuff that for me, it's hard through the book of Revelation to draw these lines of like, well, the seven, the judgments and the woes, the trumpets and the two witnesses and the dragon. And like, there's all this crazy stuff that happens in the book of Revelation. Okay. And some scholars, full and partial preterists, have done the work to draw the lines between those things prophesied and the fall of Jerusalem and the years following, Jesus's death leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. But I'm just going to go and out on a limb here and say, I don't know what all those things exactly reference, but I do think that those things reference most of Revelation from 4 till about 20 reference things that were meant to happen during the first century, right? And then you'll notice a phrase that was in Isaiah 65. It's in Mathhew 24. It's in Mark 13. It's in Luke 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, right? And from this point on, again, you're going to see he's going to wipe every tear from their eyes, right? So it's referencing sort of the Isaiah 65 prophecies there. There'll be no more tears. And then there's this, pretty powerful description of the new Jerusalem, right? And this probably has some correlations with Ezekiel, 40 and beyond. Um, and it describes the city, the big city. There were streets of gold. There was all this crazy stuff. You go into Revelation chapter 22, Garden of Eden is restored. We have access to the tree of life again. Now, again, for a futurist, they look at this stuff and they say, well, obviously none of this stuff has happened yet. A full preterist actually looks at this stuff and says, this actually all has happened, and there are spiritual meanings behind all of these things that are being described here, right? If I'm giving credit to the full preterists, they will highlight that even in chapter 22, he says the time is near for these things to be fulfilled, right? So I got to give these guys credit where it's due. They're the ones trying very hard to really pay attention to John and Jesus' statements about, you know, these things are happening, this time is near. But I think similar to Jesus' prophecies, where he says all these things will happen this generation, and then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. I think there's a breaking point Jesus provides, Isaiah provided, other Old Testaments too, and then John provides in his revelation for us to be able to say, okay, I mean, things are cool and there's lots of, spiritual possible correlations between Revelation 22 and Revelation 21. But in my experience, I kind of think this is still to come. I think like we haven't had the marriage of the Lamb, with Christ and his bride, like I just don't think that we're quite there yet. I haven't seen it. Now, can I go back through Revelation and tell you how everything else in Revelation has happened? The fall of Babylon, prostitute and the beast, the seven bowls, the seven plagues, the lamb and the 144. That listen, guys, there are scholars that are full or partial preterists that could go back through this and they've done the work and they say, look at how this stuff all happened already. And I'm not going to try to go chapter by chapter in Revelation, but I wanted to outline for you, and I hope that I have the futurist partial preterist, which is where I land, and the full preterist position of Jesus's prophecies and the book of Revelation. And of course, then that also means some of these Old Testament prophecies. We believe that there is a breaking point in these prophecies where there is a gap. And again, just for kicks, because I haven't necessarily shown you this, but I mentioned it, that in Luke 21, when Jesus does the same, prophecies about Israel, you see all this stuff, kingdom of God is near, this generation will not pass away, and then heaven and earth will pass away. I think this is a key phrase Jesus uses to indicate I'm now going to talk about something before, everything before this is going to happen in this generation. And then what am I talking about beyond this? I think he's talking about when heaven and earth will pass away, whatever that means exactly, because I'm not even sure I can tell you what that whole means, but that there will be another coming of the Son of Man. Everything before this point has signs and look out for, and you'll see it coming. And then everything beyond this point will come suddenly like a trap, basically like you're not going to know when this stuff is going to happen. And again, just for kicks, because we showed you Luke, why don't we go ahead and show you Mark 13? Same thing. Watch out. This is going to happen. Be brought to trial. Gospel will be preached. Woe to you in this day if you're pregnant. And again, this lesson from the fig tree, this is also in these three gospels as well. Pay attention to the lesson from the fig tree. When the twigs get tender and the leaves come out, you know that the summer is near, right? So Jesus is trying to give them all these signs that on this generation, these things are going to happen. And then heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, right? So so repetitive. I mean, the Gospels will retell the same stories of Jesus over and over again, but oftentimes not with this level of specificity. And then again, Mark, Luke, and Matthew all have events that happen after Jesus makes these statements, and they all seem to be events that point to, much shorter in Luke and Mark, by the way. Matthew goes on to do the parables and all of Matthew 25. Basically, there's going to be another coming, but it'll be sudden, and you're not going to know when that one's going to happen. What is that? That is Jesus coming back. right? And it seems that it will be very obvious when Jesus comes back, like every, new heaven and new earth, New Jerusalem, all that. And so again, this is where, I understand the trying to be consistent as a full preterist and say all of Revelation and all of what Jesus prophesied seems to have happened. I understand the consistency of that, but I think there's a very clear breaking point in each of these prophecies and in the book of Revelation and Isaiah and others where there are things that have still not happened. Can I point to everything that's happened in earlier parts of Mark, Luke, Matthew, and say, hey, I know exactly what this event was during the first century? No, not necessarily. But again, I take it on faith of what Jesus said, John said, that those things did happen during that time, right? So I hope this has been helpful. I've tried to kind of lay out these views and how they work with these different passages. I mentioned this 10 times maybe, but there's another video I have where I dive more into the prophecies of Jesus and this generation and why you should not try to predict the second coming of Christ specifically. So watch that video and this video in combination, I think is very helpful. So this is Charlie. I hope you have enjoyed this video.